In this video, we're going to find out what a lake really sounds like. Now, I know what you're probably thinking. I know what a lake sounds like. It sounds like this. To which I would respond, sure, but what do lakes really sound like? Let me explain. Sound is waves. Lakes have waves. Sound waves travel through air. Lake waves travel through water. When a sound wave reaches us, it pushes and pulls on the tiny little hairs in our ears, which is translated by our brain into sound. So to hear what a lake really sounds like, under the arbitrary definition I'm now invoking, we'll need a method of converting the waves of a lake into waves within air, which our brain can then receive as sound. To do this, we'll need a method of detecting and recording the waves. Then we'll need to convert that recorded signal into a format which can be played back as audio. So phones these days come with accelerometers built in, which you can record data from. My plan is to place my phone in a lake on a small raft of some kind, which can function as a pickup/sensor, recording data of the lake's waves. The rotation data from the phone will be recorded in a continuous stream, which can then be converted into sound. Converting this signal to sound isn't straightforward though. There's two primary yet oddly complementary limitations. My estimation is that the lake's larger waves are likely to be between 2 and 4 seconds in length. Converted to audio, that's less than a single hertz, which is well below the range of human hearing, which begins at around 20 hertz. That's our first limitation. The second is that the phones can only sample rotational information 100 times a second. That might sound like a lot, but converting that signal directly to audio will result in only bass and subsonic frequencies, as the highest sound frequency it's capable of producing is 100 hertz, which sounds like this. In order to reproduce the full frequency spectrum of sound humans can hear, modern microphones and speakers are active from 20 Hz all the way up through 20,000 Hz. So you can see that at a sampling rate of 100 Hz, the phone's accelerometer is unable to pick up fine levels of vibrations needed to produce audible sound beyond a very low rumble. In order to hear anything meaningful from the lake, we'll need to speed playback up a lot. According to the preliminary maths I've done, the data will need to be played back at approximately 100 to 200 times faster than real time to bring the sound into a comfortable, audible hearing range, accounting for both the low sampling rate and the low frequency of the waves. The first thing to test will be converting the accelerometer signal from my phone into an audio signal. Once that's worked out, next step will be to create an appropriate raft to place the phone onto to send into the water. Then we'll convert the recorded signal of the waves into audio. So I found an app for Android called Sensor Logger, which does a very good job of recording the phone's various sensors. For this, I'll be using the orientation sensor, which takes data from the phone's accelerometer and uses that to figure out the phone's orientation in space, detecting pitch, roll, and yaw. To test this out, I recorded 10 minutes worth of data to speed up and listen back to. Sonifying my phone's accelerometer readings is theoretically very simple to do. It's just encoding the accelerometer information into a WAV file's PCM data. Easy, but I'm not a programmer, so actually implementing this was a bit challenging. Fortunately, ChatGPT exists, and I was able to use it to produce code to sonify my phone's data. This took a few hours to get working as it produced an endless stream of error messages, which I'd send right back into ChatGPT, which then made adjustments to the code, which produced more error messages, rinse and repeat. This process lasted for about 5 hours before it produced a WAV file, which was awful and broken. Another few hours later, it had successfully converted the data straight from my phone's accelerometer to audio. Then I used Ableton's repitch warp settings to increase the playback speed of the data by 130 times, and here's what it sounds like. Amazing, right? So now we have the sonification of our data covered. Next step is to build the raft which can safely carry my phone onto a lake. After contemplating the design for a few days, I drew up a plan, collected materials, and began assembling. Apologies if this seems entirely janky. My understanding of buoyancy and raft building is quite limited, and despite doing a mild amount of planning and research, I ended up improvising a lot of the design as I went. Anyways, I wanted to talk about data sonification in this video, and now seems like a good time to do it. So data sonification is the thing that I'm trying to do here with converting waves on water into sound waves. Technically, this would actually be Audification, but I'll get more in depth on that in a bit. So one of the earliest examples of data sonification would be Geiger counters, which take a reading of the local radiation and represent it with audible clicks. The way this works is a Geiger-Müller tube is filled with a non-conductive gas, which acts as a breakpoint in a high-voltage circuit. Then, when a high-energy particle of radiation passes through the tube, it will temporarily become conductive and the circuit will be completed, allowing a signal to be sent to a sound module which produces an audible click. So every time it encounters radiation, circuit's complete, you get a click. Pretty cool. Newer technology has allowed for the development of different forms of sonification over the years, with different types of data readings being translated in different ways. NASA's been getting into sonification in recent years, taking images and data sets of space and interpreting the data into audio to listen back to. There can actually be patterns within data that our ears are better attuned to detecting than is allowed by other modes of analysis. So our ears are attuned to detecting frequency, amplitude, timing, and tempo. Psychoacoustics is a whole thing. There's a myriad of processes our brains run on the sound our ears pick up, which is used to derive information about our immediate environment. Phase, volume, and frequency differences of a single sound source from one ear to another tells the brain a lot about what produced that sound and where it's coming from, which, from an evolutionary perspective, can be important for hunting and for avoiding becoming prey. A deep, low-end sound in nature is the result of something large and possibly immediately threatening. The result of this is that low-frequency tones tend to activate an autonomic nervous system response, specifically the sympathetic nervous system, which is responsible for fight or flight. So our perception of sound has immediate short-term survival implications. The sound wave can also interact with features of the environment, which cause reflections and reverberations, giving the brain a lot of information about features of the environment, which is interpreted in conjunction with your visual senses to build a mental model of your surroundings. This is why ADR can at times be quite jarring. ADR is dialogue replacement for movies and TV. Basically, the audio recorded on the day of filming wasn't good enough for whatever reason, so they put the actors in a booth to dub their lines over after the fact. But unless the sound engineer is very careful to reproduce and match the sonic profile of the environment being shown on screen, it can be quite disconcerting. I've seen movies where the characters are talking outside, but you can hear the reflections from the space where the lines are being dubbed from. The space you're hearing doesn't share any acoustic properties with the space you're seeing, which results in a very jarring audio-visual experience. Anyways, point is, our brains have been tuned by our historical environment over hundreds of millions of years of evolution to be really good at deriving information from audio, which makes the sonification of data a worthwhile and sensible thing to do. Scientists are able to use sonification in conjunction with other data analysis techniques as a tool for studying and analyzing data sets.
And there's evidence that this is actually a pretty good idea. Here's a real good example. There's an astronomer named Wanda Diaz-Merced. She was rendered blind by an illness. And she worked to develop this program called Sonify that allows her to listen to graphs. And in her TED Talk, she describes quite compellingly how this enables her to work at the same level of research that she was working at when she was sighted. And what's more, she was able to detect the presence of certain electromagnetic resonances by listening to these data sets that nobody had detected by visual inspection. And so a lot of her sighted colleagues find that they like to use it because they can often hear patterns that they have trouble seeing.
Various forms of information don't translate one-to-one in their characteristics to the properties of audio. So in order to sonify data, the sonifier must decide which aspects of the data should be sonified and in what manner. A common approach is to map data points to specific parameters of a synth/sound module, creating a conditional rule set by which certain sounds are triggered, essentially turning the data into MIDI information which is mapped to the notes, timbre, amplitude, or any other MIDIable parameter. Just a quick aside, there's a YouTuber called MicroLyco who utilizes this approach but with a modular synth setup, which is receiving a live signal directly from various mushroom and fungi. It's some pretty cool stuff, which you should go check out if you haven't already. Anyways, in 2015, LIGO, a gravitational wave observatory, measured the gravitational waves that were emitted from the merger of two black holes. They then converted this data directly to audio and published it to their YouTube channel. You're not hearing an interpretation of the data controlling a MIDI device or some interpretation of the signal. You're hearing the signal converted directly into audio. LIGO's measurements result in a one-dimensional string of information that's measured across time. This happens to also be the amount of dimensions that recorded audio has, meaning that their data can be converted directly into an audio file, allowing us to hear the sound of two black holes colliding together. Apparently, when colliding black holes rotate around each other at a frequency that conveniently falls within the frequency range that we hear at, and being quite subby with an exponential rising pitch. This sound can be reversed and used as a kick drum sample if you're into that kind of thing. This type of sonification is called Audification, and is the type I'm planning on using to convert the waves of a lake into an audio signal, except I'll be increasing the playback speed to bring the data into the audible human hearing range. So after a few days of assembling and varnishing, it was time to do an initial test to find out how the phone raft handles being in water. Turns out that I hadn't nailed the concept of buoyancy, so I added some miscellaneous stuff as weights to improve things. This was somewhat effective, but the raft was still floating in a lopsided manner, so I disassembled a pull toy to make the raft float better. I then removed the miscellaneous stuff I'd been using as weights and filled the raft with cement, let it sit for a few days to properly dry, and then attached the lid to the main body, adding plenty of wood glue to create a watertight seal. Now, all that was left to do was take it out onto a lake. So I bought a hat and attached an action camera to it, secured my phone raft in the back of my kayak, then set sail. Almost immediately my paddle broke, which was super annoying, but I made do. So I continued on using half a paddle, determined to capture the secret sonic goodness of the waves. Once I was far enough out into the water, I brought out the phone raft, opened up the lid, and secured my phone within it. I wanted to capture at least an hour's worth of data, which would result in about 30 seconds worth of playback. Then using my other phone, I've got two phones. Yeah, I put the less important phone into the raft. Then using my other phone, I put on an audiobook and then proceeded to wait for an hour. I noticed a few things about the raft during this time. It responded to the waves, but seemed a bit overly responsive. There was an almost springiness to its response to the waves. My suspicion was that this must cause some degree of resonance which is being added to the signal of the waves. I believe this is due to how deep the raft sits in the water and the general weight. If I was to build this raft again, I'd like to try to create the raft out of styrofoam or pull toys from the start. The reason I didn't this time was to make sure it definitely didn't topple over in the water, as I'm not super confident in my understanding of buoyancy. But despite the artifacts introduced into the signal by the raft itself, it looked like it more or less worked. Before listening to it, I made a few predictions about the sound. I believed there would be some noise, but also a stable tone, possibly multiple. Apart from that, I was ready for anything. Anyways, that's enough suspense. Here's what a lake really sounds like. I'm so sorry, I'm lying to you, it didn't work. First recording just actually didn't work. The app doesn't actually record data with the screen turned off, something I found out the hard way. So I went out again the next day, and I was able to find a replacement paddle, which was good. This time the wind had really picked up, and I really had to push through the waves to get any distance into the lake. Luckily, the phone raft was able to handle the conditions and not drown or topple or anything, although I noticed that same springiness again. The night before going out the second time, I'd ran a few tests. For the test, I just slowly shook my phone over an hour whilst watching a TV show, and the results sound strangely similar to a record needle being dragged across a rough surface, which is something we all know what that sounds like. That's a normal thing to know what that sounds like, I'm sure. I'm mentioning this because that's what was in my mind as I was watching the phone raft this time out on the lake, as an aquatic stylus being dragged across the surface of the waves, like I was some tiny ant or microbe or something watching in hyper slow motion as some incomprehensibly large-scale pickup device read some deeper information out of what appeared to me as only meaningless, semi-regular contours. Anyway, here's what it sounds like. So I'm not sure what I expected. Kind of just sounds like wind. Yeah, so I suspect that it might sound a bit more interesting on a day with calmer weather, where the water is as still as it was on the first attempt. My belief was that since this recording was taken with a lot of wind and very turbulent waves, I think it caused a very noisy, wind-like recording. As in, I think the larger waves are irregular. I think that's the main thing that can be taken from that test. I wasn't content to stop just yet though, so the next day I went out again and recorded this. So, not really sure what I was hoping for. I guess I was hoping there'd be more regular detectable patterns, but that wasn't the case. The waves are irregular enough that stable tones just aren't present. There's a clumping of sonic frequencies, which makes a lot of sense considering that wavelengths don't seem to be varying all that much, just enough to prevent stable tones from arising. A few days later, I went back out again in much stiller weather. For practical reasons, I wasn't able to get a long shot of the lake. Anyway, here's what I captured. So there's a lot more to be heard in calm weather. Actual tones this time. Very exciting. The lack of a wide shot of the lake makes analysis a bit difficult, but you can see that the lake is very still, producing the constant noise/hum, and as the wind picks up and patterns start to form on the lake's surface, you can hear it as these scratchy kind of sounds, almost like air brushing up against an elastic surface, which, in the abstract, is kind of basically what's happening. I brought the raft whilst still recording over to a nearby island, so we also found out what kayaking sounds like. I let the raft drift along the shore of the island for a bit. It sounded about the same as in the rest of the lake. You can hear me prodding it, trying to push it further out into the lake. Then comes the sound I find the most interesting. The slight rising pitch as the raft moves into a patch with some light, regularly patterned waves. Then I brought it a bit further into the lake. By this point, the wind had picked up very slightly, making ripples and mild turbulence in the waves. So I discovered that calm weather is ideal for picking up anything interesting to listen to in the waves. If I do this again, I think next time I'd make some adjustments to my methods. I'm not super convinced about the decision of the phone raft. Now that I've spent some time observing how it behaves in water, I have some alternative designs in mind which might more accurately track the waves with less bounce and spring, whilst still accounting for the buoyancy problem, hopefully. There was a lot of interesting wave patterns which were finer than what this initial iteration of the phone raft could detect. As well, I have to wonder about the 100Hz sampling limit. I suspect, especially with the finer patterns, that to hear them, it'd be better to sample more frequently than 100Hz, but that would require obtaining more specialized tools, which I assume would absolutely ruin me financially, so I won't be doing that. But if I do return to this idea, I'll definitely be redesigning and rebuilding the raft to function as a more accurate sensor. Overall, I'm satisfied with how this all came out. I can confidently say that I know what a lake sounds like. It doesn't sound like this. Sounds like this. I have other related ideas similar to this one, which I may explore in the future, somewhat depending on the reception of this video, I guess, maybe, I don't know, or I might just do it anyway. Anyway, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, consider hitting like and/or subscribe, helps the channel, yada yada. Also have a Patreon if you'd like to support the channel further. Okay, bye.